The Fourth Crusade did not begin with a king's decree, nor with an emperor's ambition. It began in the heart of France at a tournament in the castle of Acre in the closing weeks of November 1199. The nobility of Champagne and Blois had gathered for the sport of war, to break lances and display their prowess in the tilt-yard. But the atmosphere that autumn was heavy with a different kind of burden. From the chair of St. Peter in Rome, a new and energetic pope, Innocent III, had issued a thunderous call to Christendom. He demanded a return to Jerusalem. The Holy City had been lost to Saladin nearly a decade prior, and the Third Crusade, despite the heroics of Richard the Lionheart, had failed to reclaim it. Innocent preached that this failure was a divine judgment on the sins of Europe, and he demanded a new, purer effort, not by kings who were consumed by their petty squabbles, but by the knighthood of the West. At Acre, the message took hold. In a sudden swell of collective piety, the tournament was abandoned. Count Theobald of Champagne, a young and charismatic figure, was the first to step forward. He did not pick up a lance, but a cross. He was joined by Count Louis of Blois and later, the formidable Baldwin of Flanders. These were men of the highest feudal aristocracy, wealthy, powerful, and deeply devout. They believed, with a sincerity that is difficult for the modern mind to fully grasp, that their souls hung in the balance. They pledged to leave their lands, their families, and their comforts to march into the burning sands of the East. However, unlike the Crusades of the past, they determined that they would not walk. The land route through Anatolia was a graveyard, a place of starvation and Turkish arrows. This time, the army of God would travel by sea. They would strike not at the coast of Judea, but at the heart of a Ubbid power in Egypt. To do this, they needed a fleet. But the French, masters of the horse and the field, had no ships. To solve this logistical impossibility, the barons appointed 6 envoys to secure transport. Among them was Geoffroy de Villeron, the Marshal of Champagne, a veteran soldier whose memoirs would become the definitive, if somewhat defensive, record of the tragedy that followed. In the winter of 1201, these envoys crossed the Alps. They were not heading to the ports of Genoa or Pisa, but to the rising mistress of the Mediterranean, the serene Republic of Venice. Venice was a world apart from the muddy fields and stone keeps of northern France. It was a city suspended on the water, a republic of merchants and mariners who looked east for their livelihood. While the French barons measured their worth in land and lineage, the Venetians measured theirs in gold, silk, and spices. The envoys were received with great ceremony, but the negotiations that followed were hard, pragmatic, and entirely devoid of romanticism. The Crusaders needed to move an army across the sea. The Venetians were the only power capable of building the necessary ships, but the Republic was not a charity. It was a business. At the head of the Venetian state sat the Doge, Enrico Dandolo. He was a man of frightening vitality. Already in his 90s and completely blind, some said from a blow to the head. Others whispered he had been blinded by the Byzantines during a diplomatic mission years earlier. Dandolo remained sharp, commanding, and relentlessly ambitious. He did not see the crusade merely as a spiritual endeavor. He saw it as the greatest commercial contract in the history of the lagoon. He listened to Villard-du-Wan's request, and after days of deliberation with his council, he returned with a proposal. It was a document of staggering scale, written with the precision of a ledger. The Treaty of Venice, signed in April of 1201, was a masterpiece of logistical planning. The Republic agreed to construct a fleet capable of transporting 4,500 knights and their horses, 9,000 squires, and 20,000 foot soldiers. In total, they prepared to move 33,500 men, along with all the provisions, fodder, and siege engines required for a year of war. In addition to the transport ships, the Venetians promised 50 fully manned war galleys to protect the convoy. In return, they asked for 2 things. First, half of all the conquests made by the crusade. And second, a payment of 85,000 silver marks. It was an astronomical sum. 85,000 marks was more than the annual revenue of the Kingdom of England or France. It was a price that could bankrupt nations. Yet, the envoys, swept up in the optimism of their mission and desperate to secure the fleet, agreed. They affixed their seals to the parchment, swearing on their honor and the holy gospels that the Crusaders would arrive in Venice the following summer with the money in hand. This was the first, and perhaps the most fatal, error of the Fourth Crusade. Villard-Douin and his colleagues had estimated the size of their army based on hope, not reality. They assumed that every knight who had taken the cross in France would follow them to Venice. They did not account for the fickle nature of feudal levies, nor for the fact that many crusaders would choose to sail from other ports in Italy to save money. The envoys had signed a contract for a ghost army. They had committed the crusade to a debt that could only be paid if everything went perfectly according to plan. As the envoys returned to France, the tragedy began to take shape. Count Theobald of Champagne, the young and unifying leader of the expedition, fell ill and died. The crusade was suddenly headless. In his place, the barons elected an Italian nobleman, Boniface of Montferrat. Boniface was a capable soldier, but he was a man entangled in the complex politics of the Mediterranean. His family had deep, often bitter, ties to the Byzantine Empire. Unlike the French barons, who viewed Constantinople merely as a distant Christian ally, Boniface viewed the Greeks with a mixture of familiarity and contempt. Meanwhile, in the arsenal of Venice, the hammers did not stop ringing. For a full year, the entire industrial capacity of the Republic was turned toward the war effort. Merchant trading was suspended. The shipwrights worked day and night, laying the keels of massive transport vessels and swift galleys. The Venetians were fulfilling their side of the bargain with terrifying efficiency. They were building a fleet for an army that did not yet exist, incurring massive costs that they fully intended to recoup. By the summer of 1202, ships were ready. They bobbed in the lagoon, a forest of masts waiting for the soldiers of Christ. But as the Crusaders began to trickle into Venice, the terrible arithmetic of the treaty became clear. The knights did not arrive in the tens of thousands. They came in small groups, disorganized and underfunded. The great host that Villard-Douin had promised a host that was supposed to pay the 85,000 marks was a fantasy. The Venetians stood on the docks, watching the horizon, waiting for an army that was never going to come. The debt remained unpaid, and the Doge, blind and expectant, was not a man who forgave a breach of contract. The crusade had not yet left the harbor, and already it was held captive by its own promises. By June of 1202, the reality of the situation had settled over the lagoon like a fever. The Crusaders had arrived, but they were a shadow of the great host that had been promised. Instead of 33,000 men, perhaps 12,000 had made the journey. Many others, wary of the Venetian route or simply disorganized, had sailed from other ports in Apulia or Provence, leaving the main army drastically under strength. For the leaders of the crusade, men like Boniface of Montferrat and Baldwin of Flanders, the shame was absolute. They had sworn on the Gospels to provide a massive army and the funds to pay for it. Now, they faced the Doge with empty hands. The Venetians, for their part, were furious. They had suspended their commerce for a year. They had built 500 ships that now sat empty in the harbor. The Republic had invested its own wealth into this venture, and the Doge demanded payment. The price was 85,000 marks. The Crusaders, scraping together every coin they had, melting down their own silver plate and emptying their war chests, could only raise 51,000. They were 34,000 marks short. To the modern mind, this might seem like a mere financial dispute, but in the 13th century, it was a catastrophe. The crusade was bankrupt before it had even set sail. Dandolo acted with ruthless pragmatism. He did not allow the Crusaders to enter the city of Venice itself, fearing they might cause trouble or simply disperse. Instead, he quarantined them on the Lido, a long sandy barrier island at the edge of the lagoon. It was a golden cage. The Crusaders were dependent on the Venetians for every scrap of food and every barrel of water. As the summer heat intensified, morale began to disintegrate. Sickness spread through the camp. Men began to desert, slipping away in the night to find their own way home. The army of God was rotting on a beach, held hostage by a ledger. The standoff lasted for weeks. The Doge knew that the Crusaders could not pay, but he also knew that the Republic could not afford to let the fleet sit idle. He needed a return on his investment. In late summer, Dandolo made a proposal that would change the soul of the Crusade forever. He offered to suspend the debt, not forgive it, but pause it on one condition. The city of Zara, a rival port on the Dalmatian coast, had recently rebelled against Venetian rule. If the Crusaders would help the Republic retake Zara, the fleet would sail. The proposal tore the Crusader leadership apart. Zara was not a Saracen stronghold. It was a Christian city. Its people were Catholic. Its ruler, King Emmerich of Hungary, had himself taken the cross, theoretically placing his lands under the protection of the Church. To attack Zara was to attack a fellow Crusader. The papal legate accompanying the army was horrified. He forbade the attack, warning that turning the swords of the Crusade against Christians would be a mortal sin. But the barons were trapped. They looked at their starving men on the Lido, at the Venetian galleys blocking their exit, and at the impossible debt hanging over their heads. They reasoned that if the Crusade disbanded now, Jerusalem would never be saved. They convinced themselves that this was a necessary evil, a small sin to enable a greater good. They accepted the Doge's terms. When the order was given to prepare for embarkation, the common soldiers were not told the full truth. Many believed they were finally sailing for Egypt, but as the magnificent fleet, the greatest ever assembled in the Middle Ages, finally pushed off from the Lido in October, the prows of the galleys did not turn south toward the infidel. They turned east, across the Adriatic, toward a Christian city. The Doge, blind and octogenarian, insisted on leading the fleet himself. He had the banner of St. Mark planted on the lead galley. The Fourth Crusade was underway, but it was no longer a pilgrimage. It had become a mercenary army, and its first target was one of its own. In November of 1202, the Venetian fleet appeared off the coast of Zara. The sight was terrifying in its grandeur, hundreds of galleys and transport ships filling the horizon, the water churning under thousands of oars. But for the citizens of Zara, the terror was compounded by confusion. They were Christians. They were subjects of a king who had taken the cross. Believing that this must be a misunderstanding, or perhaps a test of faith, the Zaratines hung crosses and sacred banners from their walls. It was a visual scream, a message to the attackers. We are brothers. Whatever hesitation the rank-and-file Crusaders might have felt was crushed by the orders of the Doge. The Venetians began the assault immediately, breaking the harbor chain and landing troops to construct siege engines. For 5 days, the army of God battered the walls of a Catholic city. The Zaratines, realizing no mercy was coming, surrendered. The pillage that followed was restrained compared to what would come later, but the moral damage was total. The Crusaders stripped the city of its wealth to pay their debt to Venice. As winter set in, the army quartered itself in the ruined homes of the people they had just conquered. When news of the sack reached Rome, Pope Innocent III was apoplectic. This was his nightmare realized. The sword of the Church had been turned against its own children. He immediately drafted a papal bull excommunicating the entire crusade. To a medieval knight, this was a sentence of spiritual death. It meant that if they died on this campaign, they would go to hell, not heaven. The leaders of the crusade, Boniface and the French barons, were terrified. They intercepted the letter. In a conspiracy of silence, they decided not to read the full bull to the common soldiers, telling them only that the Pope was displeased, but that they could earn absolution. The army spent the winter in Zara, shivering, guilty, and morally adrift. It was into this camp of excommunicated sinners that the devil, or perhaps a savior, arrived. Envoys appeared on behalf of a young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos. His father, the Emperor Isaac II, had been blinded and deposed by a usurper uncle in Constantinople. Young Alexios was desperate to reclaim his throne, and he knew the Crusaders were desperate for money. He made them an offer that seemed to solve every problem they had. If the Crusaders would sail to Constantinople and help him overthrow the usurper, Alexios promised to do 3 things. First, he would place the Eastern Orthodox Church under the authority of the Pope in Rome, a prize the Vatican had sought for centuries. Second, he would pay the Crusaders 200,000 silver marks, enough to pay off the Venetian debt and make every knight in the army a rich man. And finally, he would provide 10,000 Byzantine soldiers to join the crusade for the march on Jerusalem. It was a dazzling, impossible promise. To the rough barons of the West, Constantinople was a city of infinite wealth, a magical place where such sums might actually exist. The Dutch, seeing a chance to cripple Venice's commercial rival, supported the plan enthusiastically, but the army fractured. Many honest knights, disgusted by the diversion to Zara and refusing to attack another Christian city, deserted on the spot, finding their own way to the Holy Land. But the leadership, trapped by their debt and seduced by the prince's gold, agreed. They convinced themselves that this was not a deviation, but a detour, a strategic move to secure the resources they needed to win the ultimate victory. As the fleet left Zara in the spring of 1203, the Holy Land was now thousands of miles behind them. Ahead lay the Queen of Cities. In June of 1203, the fleet arrived at the Bosphorus. For the men of the West, who had spent their lives in the wooden towns and stone keeps of Europe, the sight of Constantinople was a physical shock. Geoffroy de Villeroy wrote that they could not believe that so rich a city could be in all the world. They saw walls that seemed to scrape the sky, church domes plated in gold, and a metropolis of nearly 500,000 souls larger than Paris, London, and Rome combined. It was a civilization operating on a scale that the Crusaders could barely comprehend. But mixed with their awe was a dangerous covetousness. They were hungry, debt-ridden soldiers looking upon the greatest prize on earth. The usurper emperor, Alexios III, watched the fleet arrive with a strange paralysis. He had an army that outnumbered the Crusaders and fortifications that had repelled armies for 800 years, but he lacked the will to fight. The Crusaders landed first on the northern side of the Golden Horn, at Galata. In a swift and violent skirmish, they captured the Tower of Galata, the anchor point for the massive iron chain that stretched across the harbor to block enemy ships. A Venetian ship, the Aquila, equipped with giant shears, drove onto the chain, snapping the iron links under the weight of its hull. The Golden Horn was open. The fleet swept into the harbor, bringing the war directly to the city's softer underbelly, the seawalls. On the 17th of July, the assault began in earnest. It was a coordinated strike. The French knights attacked the land walls near the palace of Blanchet, while the Venetians attacked from the water. The French were repelled by the elite Varangian Guard, English and Danish mercenaries wielding great battle axes, but the Venetians found a way through. The blind Doge, Enrico Dandolo, stood fully armed on the prow of his galley, the banner of St. Mark in his hand, screaming at his men to put him ashore or be stripped of their rank. Driven by shame and fear of their leader, the Venetians drove their ships onto the shingle. They lowered flying bridges from the masts of their vessels directly onto the tops of the Byzantine towers. It was a feat of engineering and courage that broke the defenders' nerve. The Venetians seized 25 towers and set fire to the nearby buildings to create a buffer. The smoke terrified the usurper Alexios III. Despite leading a massive sortie out of the gates, he refused to engage the smaller Crusader army, retreating back inside the walls amidst the jeers of his own people. That night, realizing his support had collapsed, the emperor packed as much gold and jewels as he could carry and fled the city, abandoning his wife and his crown. The next morning, the Crusaders woke up prepared to die, only to find the gates open. The coup was over. The blind and deposed Emperor Isaac II was let out of his dungeon and placed back on the throne, and his son, the Crusaders' puppet Alexios IV, was crowned co-emperor. The Crusaders had done the impossible. They had toppled a regime and installed their own man. Now, they sheathed their swords and extended their hands, waiting for the 200,000 marks they had been promised. But as young Alexios IV looked into the imperial treasury, he found it nearly empty. His uncle had taken everything. The debt was still owed, the army was still waiting, and the city of Constantinople was beginning to realize that its liberators had no intention of leaving. The autumn of 1203 brought a cold wind to the Golden Horde, but the atmosphere inside the palace was suffocating. The young Emperor Alexios IV was discovering the lethal cost of his crown. He had paid the Crusaders roughly half of the promised 200,000 marks, but the treasury was dry. To satisfy the relentless demands of the Venetians and the French barons, he was forced to commit an act of spiritual suicide. He ordered the stripping of the churches. Ancient icons, silver candelabras, and sacred vessels that had adorned the Hagia Sophia for centuries were seized and melted down into coin. For the citizens of Constantinople, this was not tax, it was sacrilege. The people watched as the holy faces of their saints were cast into the fire to pay foreign mercenaries. The mood in the streets shifted from suspicion to murderous hatred. Alexios was no longer seen as a liberator or even a legitimate ruler. He was a traitor, a Latin puppet who was selling the soul of Byzantium to save his own skin. He stopped visiting the Crusader camp, terrified of leaving the safety of his guards. Yet he was equally terrified of his own subjects. The alliance was rotting from the inside out. Outside the walls, the Crusaders grew restless. They were camped in the suburb of Galata, watching the city they had saved turn against them. Drunken brawls between Latin soldiers and Greek citizens became common, but in August, a skirmish escalated into a catastrophe. A group of Crusaders, in a fit of religious or drunken zeal, set fire to a mosque in the Muslim quarter of the city. The fire, fanned by a strong north wind, escaped their control. It tore through the densely packed wooden houses of the commercial district. For days, the inferno raged, cutting a swath of destruction through the heart of the city. It was one of the worst fires in history, destroying more houses than were contained in the 3 largest cities of France combined. The Crusaders watched the smoke rise from across the water, realizing that they were now hated not just as creditors, but as destroyers. In this chaos, a new figure emerged from the shadows of the Byzantine court. Alexios Doukas, known by the nickname Murtzouphlos due to his thick, brooding eyebrows, was a nobleman who despised the Latins. He channeled the rage of the population, presenting himself as the only man strong enough to stand up to the invaders. In late January of 1204, he made his move. He lured the young Emperor Alexios IV into a trap, imprisoned him, and had him strangled to death in a dungeon. His blind father, Isaac II, died shortly after, some say of grief, others say of poison. Murtzouphlos crowned himself Alexios V and immediately prepared for war. He did not send gold to the Crusader camp. He sent executioners to the walls to display his defiance. He reinforced the defenses, heightened the sea walls with wooden superstructures, and expelled every Latin resident from the city. The gates were slammed shut. The Crusaders were now in a terrifying position. They were thousands of miles from home, with no money, no supplies, and no allies. The fiction of the detour was over. The Doge and the barons realized there was only one option left. They could not sail away unpaid and starving. They would be destroyed by the winter seas or the Byzantine navy. They had to take the city, or they would die beneath its walls. The bishops accompanying the army, desperate to justify the survival of the host, absolved the soldiers of their sins in advance. They declared that the Greeks were schismatics, murderers of emperors, and enemies of God. The war against Christians was now, officially, a crusade again. On the morning of April the 12th, 1204, the final assault began. The Crusaders, their backs to the sea and starvation staring them in the face, fought with the fury of trapped animals. A strong north wind, which many later claimed was the breath of God, blew directly into the harbor, pushing the Venetian ships against the walls. Two ships, the Pilgrim and the Paradise, were lashed together to form a massive floating platform. As they slammed against the tower, a Venetian sailor and a French knight named André d'Herbois leaped across the gap. They secured a foothold on the battlements. It was the crack in the dam. The defenders, demoralized by months of coups and chaos, saw the Latins on the wall and broke. The Varangian Guard, the only unit willing to fight to the death, was overwhelmed. The Crusaders smashed open the gates from the inside, and the knights rode into the city. Murtzuphlus, the man who had promised to save Byzantium, fled into the night. The city of Constantine, the new Rome, which had stood inviolate for 9 centuries, lay open to the invaders. What followed was 3 days of horror that would permanently sever the Eastern and Western churches. The Crusaders did not act as soldiers of Christ. They acted as a scourge. The discipline of the army evaporated instantly. They fanned out through the streets, raping, killing, and looting without distinction. Even the nuns in the convents were not spared. But the greatest tragedy occurred in the Hagia Sophia. Drunken soldiers rode their horses into the sanctuary. They tore down the velvet hangings, smashed the silver altar to pieces to share the loot, and sat a prostitute on the patriarch's throne to sing bawdy songs while they drank wine from sacred chalices. The great library of Constantinople, the repository of the ancient world's knowledge, was burned. Bronze statues from ancient Greece, survivors of 1,000 years, were melted down for coin. The cultural heritage of antiquity was liquidated in a weekend. When the violence finally exhausted itself, the victors sat down to divide the spoils. It was the greatest transfer of wealth in medieval history. The Venetians, with their characteristic appreciation for art, took the 4 bronze horses from the Hippodrome and sent them back to Venice to adorn the facade of St. Mark's Basilica, where they stand to this day. The French barons elected Baldwin of Flanders as the first Latin emperor of Constantinople. They carved up the Byzantine Empire like a roasted carcass, creating a patchwork of feudal states. But it was a hollow victory. The Latin Empire was weak, hated by its subjects, and financially ruinous. The Crusader movement itself was mortally wounded. The moral authority of the Holy War had been shattered. The Fourth Crusade never reached Jerusalem. It never fought a single battle against the Saracens. Instead, it destroyed the one power that had protected Europe's eastern flank for centuries. The Byzantine Empire would eventually be restored, but it would be a ghost of its former self, too weak to stop the rising tide of the Ottoman Turks. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, the cracks in the walls had been made 250 years earlier by the hands of fellow Christians.